So, I want you to imagine standing in the choking dust of your own city.
Right.
The walls that you thought were, completely impenetrable are just reduced to scattered rubble. The temple, the very center of your universe, is a smoldering ruin.
Yeah, it's a horrific scene.
It really is. And you and your family are chained together, dragged hundreds of miles across a brutal desert. And when you finally arrive in the capital city of your enemy, you're forced to watch these massive gold-plated statues of their gods being paraded through the streets while your captors cheer.
Wow.
If you were there, right, standing in the dirt of 6th century BC Babylon, seeing all of this visual evidence, you would probably conclude that your God had been defeated.
Absolutely, you would.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're looking at a huge stack of theological texts and biblical commentaries focused on a single, really astonishing ancient text, which is the book of Isaiah, chapter 46, verses 8 through 11.
It's a fantastic passage.
So our mission for today's deep dive into the source material is to examine God's knowledge of the future. And we're going to look at how these ancient words, which were originally delivered to those traumatized exiles in Babylon, completely dismantle a modern theological movement known as Open Theism.
Right, which is a massive topic.
It is.
Oh.
And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right out of the gate here. It is an incredibly natural human instinct to want to shrink things down to our own size so we can, actually comprehend them.
Oh, for sure.
We do it with abstract concepts. And if we're honest, we do it with the Creator. It is highly tempting to want a deity who feels like a peer, like a friend sitting across from you at a coffee shop who gets surprised by the same plot twists that surprise you.
Well, the authors of our provided texts argue that this desire for a peer-level deity is it's one of the most dangerous theological impulses a person can have. Because when you attempt to force the creator of the cosmos into our localized temporal experience, when you try to make him fit into a human timeline where the future is unknown, you end up distorting his nature entirely.
Right.
The texts we're reviewing today make a really compelling case that this very human desire to shrink the divine has birthed a massive theological error.
So let's get a clear working definition of this error on the table before we move forward. The texts refer to this movement as Open Theism. And I mean, on the surface, I can see why it sounds attractive to a modern audience.
Yeah, it definitely has an appeal.
It presents a framework that claims to fiercely protect human libertarian free will. It argues that because human choices haven't been made yet, they don't exist as definite, settled facts. Therefore, in their view, the future is open.
That's the core of it, yeah.
God knows everything that can possibly be known in the present moment. But because tomorrow's decisions don't exist yet, he can't know them with absolute certainty.
And the appeal of that framework is quite strong in our modern culture, primarily because it attempts to answer the problem of human suffering by insulating God from the tragedy of the world.
Which is something a lot of people want to do.
Yes, precisely. By arguing that future choices are possibilities rather than settled facts, Open Theism offers a God who is constantly learning, adapting and reacting to human behavior.
Right.
According to the text we're analyzing, this framework portrays a relational God who anticipates the future with perfect wisdom, maybe calculating probabilities better than any supercomputer ever could, but who still responds with genuine surprise or disappointment as events actually occur.
I think a helpful analogy here might clarify how this system views God's relationship to time. Open Theism essentially presents a deity who is like a friend watching a highly suspenseful movie with you for the very first time.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
He's sitting on the couch next to you, reacting to the plot twists, learning new facts as the scenes play out, and adapting his emotional state to the surprises on the screen.
Right.
Now, he might be incredibly intelligent. He might understand cinematic tropes and human psychology so well that he can guess what the villain will do next with a really high degree of accuracy. But the crucial point is that he doesn't actually know the outcome of the scene until the scene finishes playing out in real time.
That analogy captures the essence of the open theist position perfectly. And our sources trace the historical background of this movement to demonstrate that it isn't just a modern invention born on, internet forums.
Yeah, goes back way further.
It does.
Yeah.
The texts point out that the roots of this theology stretch back to 16th century Socinianism.
Okay, wait, let's pause on that.
Sure.
Because before we jump ahead to the modern era, let's look at Socinianism for a second. I think a lot of people listening might only have a vague recognition of that term, if they've heard it at all.
Fair enough.
Can we break down what that actually looked like in the 1500s? Who was Faustus Socinus? And why did he feel such a strong need to elevate human rationalism at the expense of classical doctrines?
Well, Faustus Socinus was an Italian theologian during the radical wing of the Protestant Reformation.
Okay.
And while the mainline reformers were attempting to return to the biblical text, Socinus was heavily influenced by the rationalist spirit of the Renaissance. The historical data provided in our texts shows that Socinus believed that if human beings have genuine moral responsibility, they must have absolute autonomous free will.
Ah, I see.
Right, so he concluded that if God knows your future choices infallibly, then your choices are fixed. And if they're fixed, you aren't truly free.
That's the logical leap he makes.
Yes. To preserve his specific definition of human autonomy, he argued that God's knowledge of the future must be limited. This was a radical departure from historic Christianity, driven entirely by the desire to make theology conform to a specific philosophical definition of human freedom.
That context is incredibly helpful. So this idea starts gaining traction in the 1500s, but it obviously didn't stay confined to that century.
No, not at all.
The texts indicate that this ideology evolved over time. How did it move from a fringe rationalist movement in the 16th century to something that gets debated in modern evangelical circles?
Well, the sources trace its progression through various forms of radical Arminianism. In these circles, theologians constantly struggled with the tension between human moral responsibility and the absolute unchanging decrees of God.
It's heavy tension.
It really is. Over the centuries, some thinkers pushed the boundaries further, arguing that to truly maintain human freedom, one must abandon the classical view of divine foreknowledge entirely.
Wow.
Yeah, and this historical trajectory culminated in the modern era when the concept was repackaged and popularized for the contemporary church. The text points specifically to a 1994 book titled The Openness of God, co-authored by scholars like Clark Pinnock, John Sanders, and Gregory Boyd.
1994 seems like a very specific cultural moment for this to gain massive traction. Based on the reading, their core argument is that the classical view of a static, all-knowing God isn't actually biblical at all, but rather an invention of Greek philosophy.
Yes, that's their claim.
They claim that early Christian theologians adopted the concept of an immovable, all-knowing deity from thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, rather than from the Hebrew scriptures.
Right. The authors of The Openness of God argue that Hellenistic philosophy contaminated early Christian thought. They posit that the God of the Bible is highly emotional, reactionary, and relational, and that the church traded this dynamic biblical God for a cold, unfeeling philosophical construct.
That's quite an accusation.
It is. However, the Reformed theologians authoring our source material push back vehemently against this claim. They argue that the biblical text itself, completely free from any Greek philosophical influence, demands an all-knowing sovereign God.
Yeah.
Furthermore, they highlight the staggering theological cost of adopting the open theist perspective.
Let's talk about that theological cost, because this is where the practical implications become very apparent. When I read through these materials, it seems like open theism reduces the creator of the cosmos to a temporal, localized spectator.
Yes.
By stripping him of his absolute foreknowledge, you force God into a position where he has to guess and gamble on what we might do tomorrow. He becomes a localized deity, trapped in the present moment, right alongside humanity.
That is the central critique raised by the authors of our texts. If God is trapped in the present, he is essentially a reactionary force.
Right.
He might have superior computing abilities to calculate the probabilities of human behavior based on current data, but a highly informed forecast is still just a forecast.
It's just an educated guess.
Yes. It lacks absolute certainty. If the future relies on the autonomous, unpredictable decisions of billions of human beings, God can't know for sure what will happen tomorrow until tomorrow arrives.
Which brings up a massive issue that I have to point out.
Go for it.
If God doesn't know the future precisely, how can he make guarantees about salvation?
That's the million-dollar question.
I mean, if he is constantly adapting to our unpredictable choices, how can he promise that any redemptive plan will actually succeed? What happens if humanity collectively decides to thwart his plans?
The texts identify this as the fatal flaw in the open theist system. A God who learns which future becomes actual cannot guarantee that every promise will survive the unforeseen decisions of free agents.
Wow.
Right. He might have wonderful intentions, but he cannot certify that all events will infallibly serve those intentions. If human autonomy is the ultimate deciding factor in history, then the redemptive promises of God are conditional upon human cooperation.
Which is terrifying.
Very. To counter this, the source material establishes a baseline using the Westminster Confession of Faith, specifically Chapter 3, Section 1.
I was reading through that specific excerpt from the Westminster Confession, and what struck me is the precise language it uses.
It is incredibly precise.
It doesn't just say that God has a really good view of the future. It declares that God, from all eternity, did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass.
Yes.
That is a massive distinction. God doesn't look down a corridor of time to learn what will happen. His exhaustive foreknowledge is the direct logical result of his eternal decree.
That distinction is the bedrock of Reformed theology. God knows the future because he has ordained it.
Right.
He isn't passively receiving information from a timeline that exists independently of him. The authors of our text stress that divine foreknowledge is rooted in the divine decree. He is the architect of history, not a spectator trying to anticipate the next move.
So, to bring back the movie analogy, he isn't watching the film with us and guessing the ending.
No, not at all.
He wrote the script, built the set, cast the actors, and directed every single frame of the footage.
That's a much better way to view it.
Now, to see this clash between the modern open theist view and the ancient biblical view clearly, our sources take us completely out of these academic modern debates.
Yes, they do.
They drop us squarely into an ancient geopolitical crisis. We need to travel back to 6th century BC Babylon.
And the historical context of Isaiah is absolutely vital for comprehending the theological arguments being made.
It sets the whole stage.
It really does. You can't understand the intensity of the biblical text without understanding the dirt, the sweat, and the severe trauma of the historical situation the original audience was facing. The text wasn't written in a sterile academic vacuum. It was written to a people who had lost everything.
Let's expand on that trauma for the listener. The year is 586 BC. The Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, has breached the walls of Jerusalem after a horrific, starving siege.
Just a brutal event.
The city is sacked. The temple of Yahweh is looted and burned to the ground. The surviving Judeans are rounded up, chained together, and forced on a brutal death march across the harsh, ancient Near Eastern terrain. And when they finally reach Babylon, they are integrated into a foreign culture that represents the pinnacle of human achievement and pagan idolatry.
The visual weight of that idolatry would have been psychologically devastating for the Judean exiles. The texts describe the Babylonian environment in great detail. The exiles lived in the immediate shadow of massive state idols.
Right, these huge statues.
Yeah. The chief deities of the Babylonian Empire were Bel, who was also known as Marduk, and Nebo, or Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing. The architecture dedicated to these gods was staggering.
I can only imagine.
They had colossal ziggurats and magnificent public processions, most notably the Akitu Festival, which was the great New Year celebration where these gold-plated statues were paraded through the streets to the cheers of the conquering empire.
The sensory experience of that Akitu festival must have been overwhelming.
Completely overwhelming.
Imagine the smell of incense, the chanting of thousands of priests, the sheer display of wealth and military might. In the ancient Near East, a military victory meant your local deity beat the opposing deity. It was viewed as a cosmic arm wrestling match.
That's a good analogy.
To the naked eye of a traumatized exile, the Babylonian gods had pinned Yahweh's arm to the table. The exiles were surrounded by physical, tangible evidence that their god had seemingly lost the war.
And the Babylonian culture looked at the destruction of Jerusalem as undeniable proof that Bel and Nebo were stronger than the God of Israel.
Naturally, they would.
Our sources explain that the Babylonian religious system was entirely focused on trying to manage an uncertain future. They viewed the future as volatile, open, and chaotic, largely because their gods were also subject to the whims of fate.
So even the gods didn't know it was coming.
Right, and so the Babylonian priests claimed to navigate this mystery through complex systems of divination.
The texts mention some very specific methods they used for this divination, and it is fascinating.
It is wild stuff.
They practiced hepatoscopy, which is the reading of animal livers. A priest would sacrifice a sheep, pull out its liver, and examine the lobes and blemishes, believing that the physical state of the organ reflected the intentions of the gods.
Just incredible to think about.
And they also obsessively mapped the stars through astrology, trying to find patterns in the sky that would dictate agricultural or military success. It sounds like an incredibly stressful way to live, constantly trying to guess what chaotic forces would do next.
It was a worldview driven entirely by anxiety. The Babylonians were constantly trying to guess what the gods would do next because the gods themselves didn't possess absolute sovereignty over the future.
Wow.
And the authors of our sources draw a brilliant parallel here. The temptation those ancient exiles faced is the exact same temptation a modern believer faces when confronted with tragedy.
Really?
Yeah, the exiles were tempted to see God as small, reactive, and defeated by circumstances.
That is a staggering connection. The exiles were tempted to adopt the Babylonian view that the future is chaotic, and God is just doing his best to react to a bad situation.
Yes.
That is the exact theological trap open theism sets for people today. It asks you to view God as a reactive participant in a chaotic timeline, doing his best to mitigate the damage caused by autonomous human choices.
Spot on.
When you get a terrible medical diagnosis or face a sudden financial collapse, the temptation is to believe that God was just as surprised by it as you were.
And you see, the Babylonian gods were small and reactive, needing constant appeasement precisely because they didn't actually control history. Isaiah chapter 46 is the thunderous divine response to that entire worldview.
Okay, let's get into the text.
To understand the force of this response, the texts direct us to look at the broader literary structure of Isaiah chapters 40 through 48.
The sources refer to this specific section of Isaiah as the trial of the false gods. It is structured like a cosmic courtroom scene.
Yes, it is.
God essentially convenes a legal proceeding. He acts as the prosecuting attorney, the judge, and the jury, and he puts the idols of the nations on trial to prove their absolute worthlessness.
He summons the nations of the earth and their fabricated deities to stand before the bar of absolute truth. And the central legal issue under debate in this cosmic courtroom is the definition of true deity.
Right.
The texts highlight that Yahweh issues a specific, impossible challenge to prove who alone is worthy of worship.
The legal challenge God issues is brilliant in its simplicity. He tells the idols to predict the future.
Yes.
He says, in effect, if these blocks of wood and stone are real deities, if they actually have any authority over the cosmos, they should know what happens next.
Simple as that.
He challenges them to declare the past events and explain their meaning, or predict the future with absolute precision. If you're a god, prove it by telling us what tomorrow holds.
And the inability of the false gods to meet this challenge exposes them as empty wind. The immediate context of chapter 46 takes this legal challenge a step further by utilizing intense literary irony and satire.
Oh, this satire's biting.
It is. In the first 4 verses, Isaiah openly mocks Bel and Nebo. He describes these highly revered gods, the very statues paraded during the Akitu festival, not as majestic rulers of history, but as heavy, dead cargo.
The imagery used here is basically a cosmic comedy sketch.
Yes.
The text says, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. These idols, which the entire Babylonian Empire trusted to secure their future, are depicted as being loaded onto weary beasts of burden.
Right.
The text explicitly notes that the animals are tired because the gods are so heavy. The idols can't save their worshippers, they can't even walk. They must themselves be carried away into captivity as loot on the backs of exhausted donkeys.
The visual contrast Isaiah draws in this passage is breathtaking, and the theological commentators in our sources point this out as a masterclass in ancient polemics.
It's so good.
Isaiah depicts the pagan worshiper who has to hire a goldsmith, hand over his silver, build an idol, bow down to it in reverence, and then physically lift it onto his own shoulders to move it across the room. The idolater must exert physical energy to carry his god.
And right after mocking the heavy idols, Yahweh speaks to the house of Jacob and provides this beautiful, tender contrast.
Yeah.
He says, I have carried you from the womb, and even to your old age, I am he, and I will bear you. The idolater has to strap his god to a donkey just to get him across the street, but Yahweh carries his people from the moment of conception to their final breath.
What a picture.
The contrast between a dead weight and a living savior is incredibly vivid.
The authors of our texts deduce a rigorous logical argument from this poetic contrast. A god you have to carry cannot possibly guarantee your tomorrow.
Right, because you're the one sustaining it.
Yes, if your deity is subject to gravity, fatigue, and the physical strength of a pack animal, it is entirely absurd to trust that deity with the geopolitical future of nations.
It makes total sense.
And this literary contrast of carrying versus being carried sets up the specific commands God gives to the anxious exiles in verses 8 and 9.
Let's read those specific commands and break them down. Isaiah 46, verses 8 and 9 say, Remember this, and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old.
Right.
God is talking to a traumatized, anxious group of people living in exile, and his primary command is to look backward.
This raises a fascinating pastoral and psychological question that our sources address. Why does God point people who are terrified of tomorrow toward their memories of the past?
I would think that when you're terrified of what's going to happen next week, looking backward feels completely counterintuitive.
Yeah, normally it would.
You want a map of the future. You want someone to tell you exactly how you're going to get out of Babylon. You don't want a history lesson about things that happened hundreds of years ago.
To understand the divine logic here, the texts analyze the specific Hebrew concept of memory used in the passage. The word is zikaru. The commentators stress that this is not a request for nostalgic sentimentality. God isn't asking the exiles to fondly reminisce about the good old days in Jerusalem before the walls fell. Zikaru is a deliberate, active recollection of objective, space and time history.
So he's pointing them back to specific historical events like the Exodus from Egypt.
That's right. God is anchoring their current covenantal fidelity in past historical acts of redemptive deliverance. The authors note that faith, in the biblical framework, is always anchored in historical facts, not subjective feelings, emotional highs, or mystical guesses about tomorrow. God is telling them, look at what I actually did in space and time when I split the Red Sea, decimated the Egyptian Empire, and brought your ancestors out of slavery.
The logic being that if he had the authority to dismantle Egypt and control the waters of the sea, he isn't a localized, defeated deity who lost an arm wrestling match to Marduk.
Exactly. I mean, yes, that's the point.
After calling them to remember, the text uses specific names to establish his absolute identity. The sources highlight the Hebrew names El and Elohim.
Yes, the second half of verse 9 says, "For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me." The texts explain the linguistic weight of these terms.
Break those down for us.
Sure. The first term translated as God is El, which portrays the strong, transcendent creator who towers infinitely above creation. The second term is Elohim, the plural of majesty, representing the supreme judge and ruler of all things.
And the clauses that follow those ancient names claim an absolute, non-negotiable monopoly on deity.
They do.
He repeats it twice for emphasis. I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me. It's a double assertion of absolute supremacy.
The Hebrew syntax utilized here is absolute. The scholars point out that these are nominal clauses asserting a strict monopoly. God doesn't share a category with creation.
He's not just the biggest guy in the room.
Right. He isn't simply the highest being on a sliding scale of beings where humans are at the bottom, angels are in the middle, and God is at the top. He is entirely other. The sources argue that this statement completely destroys any concept of a localized deity who learns, reacts, or waits for human choices to materialize. If God is constantly learning from humanity as the future unfolds, then there is someone like him.
Oh, that's a huge
Why
deal.
learn as time unfolds? But God explicitly denies that any such comparison can be made.
Let's unpack verse 10, because according to the materials we're studying, this is where the confrontation with open theism reaches its absolute peak.
Yes.
Verse 10 says, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done.
The theologians authoring these texts identify this verse as the core assertion of divine omniscience in the passage. God's knowledge isn't presented as a highly informed guess based on current cultural or geopolitical trends.
Let's make this crystal clear for you, the listener, with another analogy.
Good idea.
The open theist view suggests God is like a master meteorologist. A meteorologist looks at atmospheric pressure, wind patterns, humidity levels, and ocean temperatures, and says, there's a 95% chance of a Category 4 hurricane hitting the coast on Tuesday.
Right.
That is a highly informed, brilliant forecast based on all available data. But sometimes, a high-pressure system moves unexpectedly. The wind shear shifts, and the hurricane misses the coast entirely. The meteorologist isn't foolish or uneducated. He just didn't have total control over all the variables in the atmosphere.
The biblical claim, however, is entirely different from the meteorologist's model. God isn't predicting the weather. He is ordaining the weather.
Huge difference.
To adjust your analogy based on the Reformed reading of the text, it is like the author of a book telling you the ending on page 1. The author knows what happens in chapter 20 because he wrote the manuscript.
The author doesn't guess what the characters will do. He determines what they do. He controls the narrative arc, the setting, and the resolution. The meteorologist observes, the author creates. How does the actual Hebrew syntax of Isaiah 46 support this authorial view of God?
The linguistic analysis in our sources is fascinating here. The text uses the active participle magid, which comes from the root word nagad, meaning to declare or make known.
Okay.
In this specific Hebrew stem, it denotes a causative action. God actively causes the future to be known. Furthermore, the temporal span is described as mereshit aharit, which translates literally to from the absolute beginning, the end.
From the very start, the final outcome is established.
Yes. God announces things that have not yet occurred in human time as settled, unalterable facts. The parallel phrase used in the verse, and from ancient times things not yet done, encompasses all future historical events.
Everything.
Everything. The Reformed commentators argue that this includes the free, voluntary, contingent decisions of all moral agents. Nothing falls outside of this declaration.
So the obvious question that anyone reading this will ask is about the mechanism. How does God know this?
It's the logical next question.
If he isn't just looking through a massive telescope into the future to see what choices we end up making, what is the actual mechanism of his knowledge?
The second half of verse 10 provides the definitive theological answer to that question, saying, "My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." God's knowledge of the future is based entirely on his unalterable decree. He knows what will happen because he has determined what will happen.
The word cancel there, translated from the Hebrew word etza, means his settled plan or eternal purpose.
Correct. And the Hebrew verb used for shouth band is tamad. The texts place heavy emphasis on this specific word. It signifies absolute unbending persistence.
Wow.
It doesn't mean God simply hopes his plan will work out if humans cooperate. The scholars point out that the text could have used a weaker Hebrew word like kawa, which means to hope or eagerly expect, or yabal, which means to carry along with difficulty.
But it doesn't?
No, instead, Isaiah uses tama to denote structural, immovable stability. His counsel does not fluctuate, it doesn't map to human surprises, and it doesn't fail.
Okay, but I have to push back here on the logic of the source material.
Sure, go ahead.
This brings up a massive tension, perhaps the biggest tension in all of theology. If God writes the script, if he determines everything from the beginning to the end, aren't we just robots?
It's a fair question.
I know the texts mention secondary causes, but frankly, that just sounds like a theological loophole designed to avoid the reality that we're just puppets on strings.
Explain how God's absolute decree and human voluntary choices can actually coexist without contradicting each other.
That is the perennial objection, and the Reformed tradition, as cited in our materials, handles this concept of compatibilism with incredible precision.
Okay, how?
They return to the Westminster Confession, chapter 5, to answer this specific charge of fatalism or robotic coercion. The confession states that while God is the primary cause of all things, he ordains things to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently.
Break down primary and secondary causes for me. How does that practically work in human decision-making? Well, God, as the primary cause, ordains the overarching decree. However, he ordains that human beings, functioning as secondary causes, make real voluntary choices based on their own internal desires, motives, and reasoning.
Okay, I'm following.
God's decretive will is unalterable, but human agents act voluntarily without being coerced against their will. You make choices based on what you desire most in any given moment, and you are fully accountable for those desires.
Right.
God's absolute sovereignty establishes the certainty of the event, but it doesn't violate the voluntary nature of the human choice that brings the event to pass.
So certainty and responsibility are friends, not enemies, in the biblical framework.
Yes, that's a good summary.
God's knowledge comprehends voluntary acts without destroying human accountability. And what is brilliant about the structure of Isaiah is that he immediately provides a concrete historical example of this very concept in verse 11 to prove the point.
The transition in the text from abstract theology to concrete history is striking. In verse 11, God provides historical proof of his sovereignty by stating he is calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country.
The texts identify this bird of prey as Cyrus the Persian.
Yes.
It is mind-blowing to think that Isaiah actually names Cyrus in other parts of his prophecies centuries before Cyrus was even born. God identifies him as the specific ruler he would raise up to subdue the nations, overthrow the Babylonian Empire, and authorize the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
Calling him a bird of prey is a highly evocative image. The commentators note that it perfectly fits the rapid, predatory, and sweeping military campaigns Cyrus the Great was known for throughout the ancient world.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But our sources argue that this specific prophecy creates a massive, insurmountable problem for open theism.
I want to break down why it creates such a problem, because we aren't talking about a simple, isolated event here.
Not at all.
To predict that Cyrus will conquer Babylon requires accounting for millions, perhaps billions, of interconnected micro-decisions over centuries.
The logistics of an ancient empire rising are staggering. To guarantee the rise of Cyrus, God would have to account for his specific ancestors meeting, falling in love, and conceiving children at exact moments in history.
Right. You have to account for the weather patterns affecting crop yields to feed his specific army.
Yes.
You have to account for the political alliances formed in secret chambers. You have to account for the shifting ambitions of rival kings, the psychological state of individual soldiers in the heat of battle on a specific Tuesday in the desert, and the pride of the Babylonian rulers who felt secure behind their walls.
And the authors of our texts argue that if human choices are completely autonomous and logically unknowable to God until they happen, as open theism claims, then predicting the career of Cyrus with absolute certainty is a logical impossibility.
It just couldn't happen.
No. The only way an open theist God could guarantee this specific historical outcome would be to completely override the free will of millions of people, effectively turning them into robots to force the result.
Which is the exact thing open theism is trying to avoid.
Exactly. Yeah.
They built their entire system to protect libertarian free will. But to explain specific long-range biblical prophecy, they would have to completely destroy free will. The biblical model of concurrent agency, however, handles this beautifully without resorting to coercion.
The dynamics of concurrent agency are a major focal point in the commentaries. Cyrus acted out of his own authentic pagan political ambitions.
Right.
He wanted money, he wanted expanded territory, and he wanted military glory. He was not reading the scroll of Isaiah in his tent and trying to submit to the God of Israel.
Definitely not.
Yet his voluntary sinful ambitions perfectly executed God's exact redemptive purpose for the exiles.
God used the authentic, uncoerced desires of a pagan king to free his covenant people. Cyrus was a genuine human agent, fully accountable for his motives and his brutality, yet he was simultaneously the precise instrument through which the divine plan advanced.
Right.
This perfectly illustrates the primary and secondary cause distinction.
And this historical reality moves us seamlessly into the New Testament analysis provided in our texts. Cyrus, functioning as a temporal deliverer who frees captives from Babylon, participates in a redemptive pattern that points directly to the ultimate deliverer, Jesus Christ.
The sources move to the New Testament to provide the ultimate proof of this theology, which is the sovereign cross. Cyrus was a temporal shadow. Christ is the eternal substance.
The texts observe that throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus constantly operated under the framework of declaring the end from the beginning.
Yes.
He didn't act like a man waiting to see how the political winds would blow. He predicted the exact details of his betrayal, his rejection by the religious leaders, his crucifixion by the Gentiles, and his resurrection on the third day.
Down to the day.
Yes. He knew precisely who would betray him and how the crowds would react to his teaching.
And after the resurrection, the apostles look back at the trauma of the cross and explain it using the exact same theological framework we just saw in Isaiah 46.
That's right.
The source materials point us specifically to the apostolic preaching in Acts chapter 2 and the prayers in Acts chapter 4.
The commentary on Acts chapter 2 highlights the brilliance of Peter's sermon at Pentecost. Peter stands before the men of Israel and says something mathematically impossible for an open theist to reconcile.
What does he say?
He states that Jesus was delivered up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, while simultaneously stating that the men in the crowd took him and by wicked hands have crucified and slain him.
Determinate counsel.
Yeah.
That phrase carries immense weight.
It really does.
It means a plan that has been definitively bounded, marked out, and settled by an absolute decree.
The scholars break down the Greek word used there, hourismenos, which denotes a boundary or a set limit. God drew an immovable circle around the events of the crucifixion in eternity past.
Wow.
Furthermore, in Acts chapter 4, the early church gathers to pray and explicitly declares that Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel did whatever God's hand and counsel predetermined to take place.
Okay, let me pose a hypothetical scenario for you, following the logic of the open theist perspective to its natural end.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the future is unwritten, and human decisions are completely autonomous and unknown until they happen, wasn't the cross a massive, risky gamble?
The theological texts argue that a massive gamble is the horrifying, unavoidable logical conclusion of the open theist theology.
Think about the variables involved in the Passion Week.
Yeah, there are so many.
Judas could have woken up on Thursday morning, felt a pang of guilt, and chosen loyalty to his rabbi instead of 30 pieces of silver. Pontius Pilate could have listened to his wife's terrifying dream, grown a spine, ignored the chanting crowd, and released Jesus. The Roman soldiers could have decided they were tired of executing peasants and laid down their weapons in protest.
And if any of those autonomous free choices had occurred differently, the cross wouldn't have happened.
It all falls apart.
Right. The intricate prophecies of Isaiah 53, detailing the suffering servant who would be pierced for our transgressions, and Psalm 22, describing the piercing of his hands and feet and the casting of lots for his garments, would have completely failed.
The entire gospel is at stake in this debate.
It really is.
The most wicked act in human history was freely chosen by guilty men. The religious leaders hated him out of jealousy. Judas was driven by greed. Pilate was a political coward trying to prevent a riot.
Yes.
They all acted according to their own corrupt, uncoerced desires. Yet their wicked actions were perfectly decreed for the redemption of the world.
The authors conclude that if the future is open, our salvation rests entirely on chance.
A roll of the dice.
Yes. It rests on a deity who was crossing his fingers, hoping the Romans would be cruel enough to crucify his son so that atonement could be made. The texts forcefully argue that this is not the God of the Bible.
No, it isn't.
The God of the Bible ordained the cross in eternity past and executed it with absolute precision in time. The Apostle Peter refers to Christ as the Lamb foreordained before the foundation of the world.
But we have covered a massive amount of high theology today.
We really have.
We've looked at the dirt of Babylon, parsed Hebrew syntax, analyzed the logistics of Cyrus's empire, and examined the apostolic view of the crucifixion. But let's shift to the pastoral side of this discussion, because theology that doesn't impact your daily life is just academic trivia.
I completely agree.
How does this hit the ground in your everyday life? If you're driving to work right now listening to this, why does the doctrine of God's absolute decree actually matter to you?
The commentators point out that it matters immensely, operating on the principle that bad theology always produces bad pastoral practice.
Right.
The sources outline several distinct practical applications. The first major application is defeating church pragmatism.
Let's expand on church pragmatism. What does that actually look like on a Sunday morning for the average churchgoer?
Well, the texts define pragmatism as a ministry philosophy built on the unspoken assumption that the salvation of souls is a matter of human marketing, technique, and persuasion. It assumes that if a church can make the music sound like a rock concert, brew the coffee strong enough, and keep the sermon light and entertaining, unregenerate people will use their autonomous free will to choose Christ.
It essentially turns the pastor into a religious salesman trying to close a deal because God is waiting anxiously in heaven to see what the customer decides to do with the pitch.
That is the practical result of denying God's sovereign decree.
Yeah.
However, the Reformed authors argue that if God saves individuals by his unchangeable decree, if his counsel shall stand, the church doesn't need manipulative, seeker-sensitive marketing tactics to manufacture conversions.
What a relief that is.
The growth of the church relies entirely on the eternal, decretive grace of God. This doctrine frees pastors from the crushing pressure of pragmatic manipulation. They can focus solely on the faithful exposition of the biblical text, trusting the Holy Spirit to give life to dead hearts according to God's set timetable.
That sounds incredibly liberating for anyone in ministry.
It is.
The second application drawn from the text is rejecting mysticism. We see this constantly in modern religious culture. People are always chasing private prophecies, looking for signs in the sky, or trying to find hidden codes in their daily circumstances to figure out what God wants them to do with their lives.
The authors diagnose this desire for extra-biblical revelation as a symptom of an unstable faith. They argue it's a functional denial of the sufficiency of Scripture.
Oh, that makes sense.
If God has declared the end from the beginning, and if he has provided us with his completed objective word, we don't need to chase omens like the pagan Babylonian. Believers can rest securely in the public, objective revelation already given in the Bible. We don't need new private prophecies about tomorrow. We need the discipline to obey the clear commands given for today.
Which leads directly into the third application, the cure for anxiety.
This is a big one.
Worry and anxiety inherently treat the future as if it's chaotic and outside of divine control. When you lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, stressing about a terrifying medical diagnosis, a financial collapse, or the state of the culture, you're functionally living as an open theist in that moment.
That's a convicting thought.
You're assuming the future is a threat that God hasn't figured out how to handle yet.
And the pastoral texts offer really great comfort here. This doctrine assures the believer that no trial, illness, or crisis is an accident. Nothing is a surprise to God.
Nothing.
He doesn't just prepare reactive responses to your suffering. He has sovereignly ordained its limits, its purposes, and its final defeat. The Father may lead you through periods of intense darkness, but because he decreed the end from the beginning, he never loses the path.
Here is a question that always comes up when discussing this topic, and it is a completely fair one.
Okay.
If everything is decreed, if the end is already declared from the beginning and can't be changed, why should we pray? Why ask God for anything if the script is already finalized and the ink is dry?
It is the most common objection raised against this theology, but the sources argue that it fundamentally misunderstands how the divine decree operates in real time.
How so?
We don't pray to inform an ignorant deity about our current situation. He already knows. We don't pray to persuade an undecided God to change his mind and adopt our preferred plan. We pray because God sovereignly ordains our prayers as the very secondary causes through which he executes his decreed ends.
So, God ordains the final destination, but he also ordains the specific vehicle that gets us to that destination, and our active, fervent prayer is the vehicle.
Precisely. Because his counsel stands unalterably, prayer isn't futile. It is guaranteed to accomplish his will. Because he commands the use of means, prayer isn't unnecessary. It is essential. The authors point out that God proposed the restoration of Israel from Babylon by his eternal decree, yet he still commanded the exiles to remember, to repent, and to actively seek his face in prayer. The decree guarantees the result. The prayer is the ordained method of achieving it.
There's also a very specific note mentioned in the commentaries that we should address before we wrap up. It's a dispensational point regarding the promises made to the ethnic nation of Israel.
Yes.
For those who might only know the word dispensational in passing, can you define what that means in this context and why it matters?
Broadly speaking, dispensationalism is a theological system that emphasizes a distinction between Israel and the church and argues for a literal fulfillment of biblical prophecies.
Okay.
The specific point the authors are making here relates to the literal ethnic remnant of Israel in exile. The texts argue that because God's counsel stands unalterably, his physical covenantal promises regarding the literal future restoration of national ethnic Israel are entirely guaranteed.
Right, because his decree stands.
Yes. If God's plans could be altered by the autonomous, sinful choices of humanity, those ancient promises could fail. But because his decree is absolute, the promises made to Abraham and David regarding a land and a kingdom remain completely secure regardless of human failure.
Let's bring all of this massive theological material together. We have traversed an incredible amount of ground today, moving from 16th century rationalism to the dust of Babylon, all the way to the cross of Christ.
It's been quite a discussion.
The core takeaway for you, the listener, is this. The God of the Bible is not learning. He isn't reacting. He is ruling. His knowledge is majestic, and his absolute sovereignty is the only genuinely safe place for your faith to rest. A God who can be surprised by your tomorrow cannot guarantee your eternity.
Modern culture often tells you that a responsive, learning God is more loving and relatable. But the biblical texts we review today reveal that true comfort rests on a Father who has ordained the end, a Son who secured redemption according to a definite, unchangeable plan, and a Holy Spirit who applies that redemption without failure.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Something to mull over that builds on everything we just discussed.
It's a good one.
If God's knowledge of the future is based on his unchangeable decree, think about the very moment you press play on this audio today. That was not a random choice. It wasn't a cosmic accident or a minor coincidence. Your decision to listen, to engage with these ancient words from Isaiah, was written into the fabric of history before the stars were even formed.
That is a staggering reality to consider regarding our daily lives.
It is. What else in your daily routine? What mundane conversation, what unexpected delay in traffic, or what sudden shift in your plans is actually the quiet execution of an eternal plan? Keep that in mind as you step into your tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. Take care.